Let's move now into the accessibility part of this conversation. As we did our introduction to the panel and talked about the 2020 election, one of the things that I talked about is the fact that our society today no longer accepts that we just leave behind people because of their socioeconomic status or because of their inability to mark a paper ballot. Um, I know that in this last election in the United States, there were large issues with access to the ballot for Indigenous peoples living on reservations. And I myself am a dual citizen. I'm a US and Canadian. And when I lived in Canada, I know that there was a big issue with remote communities and their access to the ballot. And so we brought in, today I wanted to have Larry Moore talk to us about accessibility and how there's large swaths of populations, whether they be rural, whether it's based on their culture or a physical disability, or because they're serving in the military overseas, that don't have access or reliable access to the ballot, and how that affects us as a society and how that's no longer acceptable. So, and how blockchain could help solve that problem. Larry, you want to?
Yeah, let me, am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah, you are
unmuted.
I belong to, and like the TON organization, there's no central command and control structure. It's a loose coalition of disability rights, veterans rights, and civil rights organizations that have come together to exercise their voice on, among other things, the topic of electronic voting. And we will be making policy recommendations to Congress and the states, and it's very interesting to be affiliated with a group of people who walk with big sticks. Some of the members of this coalition are highly litigious. They have a very impressive track record of coercing recalcitrant states to their will. But in answer to Amelia's toss to me, the disability community is not a single community. There are numerous disabilities, and if you think about it, they are permanent or they are temporary. And there's really not much difference between a person who is permanently confined to a wheelchair or a young mother who has broken her leg and on election day cannot get to the polls in any other way. And so one of the things I applauded Amelia for was her leadership in the state in the primary, where she got in, but I think it was removed, the ability for caretakers of the disability community, of disabled citizens, to vote in the same way. So so I could talk on and on. There is a study that is ongoing as we speak, conducted by two well-qualified researchers out of Rutgers University, a large-scale study covering about 3,000 individuals broken up 2/3, 1/3 between disability and able-bodied citizens as to what their experience was in the 2020 election. And that study was funded by the Election Assistance Commission to add a set of data points to a previous study conducted 12 years ago. So not only there will be a longitudinal aspect to this, but an in-depth look at the 2020 election as it affected people with disabilities. And the results are not in yet. They will be in preliminary at the end of the month and begin to be published in early January in time for the 117th Congress. So what is emerging is when you look at the definition of disability, right now it has been imposed by the state. And I use that sort of broadly speaking, not just a state, but There was a recent suit filed by the chapter of the American Council for the Blind against the state of Indiana, where there were such odious requirements on the part of people with disabilities. You had to go in person for an interview. They got to, some bureaucrat got to decide whether or not you were disabled enough to require special assistance. That all needs to disappear nationally. The idea that the disability can be defined by the state needs to disappear as well. The notion of disability should be defined at the moment by the individual. And there's a number of implications for that, one of which, the most powerful, is that we will wind up advocating for all citizens and not just people with disabilities. Because at the end of the day, you cannot really define the term disability in a non-inclusive state.
Larry, that's interesting. I'll talk in a little bit about the pilot that I'm currently trying to get passed through the legislature here in Utah. But it's interesting you say that, because as I sat down with one of the legislators that is opposing my pilot, and she said, I'm okay with people with disabilities using it, but I don't think it should be available to other people. And my reply to her was, why do you think a person with a disability has more right to vote than a single mother who can't get off work while the polls are open? Right.
Yeah.
Like, and that's kind of what you're saying. In fact, I get asked all the time, especially when I'm doing news interviews, and they ask me, they say, okay, well, you can use this for people with disabilities. How do you define a disability? And it's funny because I've never heard you say that, but the answer that I give people is, I rely on people to tell me if they have a disability. And if they tell me they do, I don't ask them what it is. I trust them.
So Amelia, there's another aspect that I think you'll find interesting that we're looking at, and that is that segregated voting is inherently discriminatory, and this becomes a civil right, not just a disability right.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really an uncomfortable parallel between not you and not now. Which was the excuse in the early days of the civil rights. And those are very similar arguments. It's the separate but equal. Mm-hmm. And all of the civil rights organizations have been fighting against the separate but equal notion. So to frame this as a civil rights issue and a personal decision are two pretty powerful concepts that we're trying to get across.
Right. So one of the reasons why I think I have a very different take on this is my background. I grew up for a large part of my childhood, we had housing insecurity. My mother is disabled, and when I was just an infant, she left an abusive husband, my father, and she had 5 children. So I'm the youngest of 5 children with a single disabled mother. And there were, like I said, several years of my life that we had housing insecurity, where at times we were homeless, at times we lived in a motel, at times we lived on the couch at a friend's house. And there was a period of time that we were moving multiple times a year. And when that happens, as an election official, when I look back on that, anyone in that situation, anyone who's in the situation that my mother was in, I want them to have a right to vote. And I don't see any of these excuses or these concerns as a viable reason to take away someone's right to vote. And maybe it's because I grew up seeing it. But
Larry and Amelia, can I ask you a question about this? And it kind of relates directly to blockchain. We just finished a panel before this one on decentralized identity. Mm-hmm. And I have 2 questions, actually one for you, Larry, one for you, Amelia. Larry, with regard to a decentralized identity, what are your thoughts about if people do have some kind of decentralized identity? And I don't know how much you know about this subject specifically, but if they do have a disability or something that gives them sort of a different set of permissions to vote, whether it's some kind of remote or mail-in or whatever, what do you think about the concept of having decentralized identity play a role in that? And the question to you, Amelia, is as an elections official, how do you do what you just talked about doing, is making sure somebody that has housing insecurity, how do you make sure that that person has a right to vote, but yet at the same time make sure that that person doesn't vote, or somebody doesn't use that person's identity to vote in multiple elections? So, so Larry, the identity question in terms of a disability as a credential, so to speak, in the decentralized identity, and then the issue of housing insecurity.
Yeah, I think so. To pick up on a thread that Eugene started on, hold on one second, is that this is going to be a journey in the United States, as distinct from, say, Estonia. There's going to be very strong headwinds toward in this topic of identity, whether it's decentralized or centralized. But I do believe that it is one of the central topics of election reform that has to occur. I mean, what we're seeing already is early stages of legislation.
Larry, you got a little bit quiet. Can you, I don't know if you accidentally covered your microphone or something, but you kind of went quiet a little bit. That's worse.
Now you went silent. Yeah, you're completely, you're not muted, but we can't hear you.
I think that's better.
Is that better?
Yes,
It's a
little better. Just head in the right direction.
Just make sure you project your voice a little bit, and I think we'll be fine.
Well, I'm speaking right into a.
There you go. We can hear you now. That's better.
Okay. Let me get back on video. So, just to repeat so I pick up my thread, is that identity is going to be the one of the great topics that need to be researched, and the advocacy position that we're trying to think about deeply is we need to begin a process of requirements gathering, testing, and eventually a national certification program. We will always be in an endless loop if we're conducting ourselves as we do now. We need a standard that we test against that evolves as we learn more, and it will be through that iterative process that we will make progress. And we need to start it on all fronts. And blockchain technology is going to be, I believe, critical to not only protecting the vote, but protecting the voter registration file. And that's where the intersection of identity and voting occurs.
Yeah.
I think that was a great way to tee that up for us, Larry. I think one of the interesting things in technology and voting is that the weakest link in our election system is not actually the transfer of the vote. When we talk about electronic voting and when we talk about utilizing blockchain to secure an electronic vote, the biggest thing that everybody talks about, and in fact, this really shows why I feel that some of these cybersecurity experts truly don't understand elections. For example, this MIT report talking about how bad blockchain is voting, every one of these critics hyper focus on the transfer of the vote. They're talking about the transfer of the actual choice. And the irony of that is that the most insecure part of our election system is exactly what you're talking about, Gerard. It's the identity piece. It's the voter registration database and the identity. If you want to look at our current election system, the most attacked part of the election system from a nation state cybersecurity standpoint is not actually the tabulation. The most attacked part of our system and the most vulnerable part of our system is the voter registration database and the process of identifying voters. And so this is one reason why as an election official, I take these reports from whether it be, MIT or Verified Voting or another one of our critics, and I take them all with a grain of salt because their naivety in how elections actually happen is shown in the fact that they're so concerned with the actual transfer of the vote. And that's the easy part to secure. The identity and the voter registration database is by far the most problematic part. But this is where technology can bring us the most help. I know that as we develop this part of it, I think there's a huge opportunity for blockchain in the voter registration database. And that's the part of the election system that I don't know of a single vendor who's currently utilizing blockchain in the voter registration database right now. I'm in talks of working with my print vendor to utilize blockchain technology to secure the voter list with them. But the actual database that is housed in the United States, it's housed by each different Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor's office. That is where I would love to see blockchain implemented in the voting process and secured. And then the other part of that is whatever solution we have, there has to be interoperability with that database, with the tabulation and election vendors and ballot creators. And I believe there needs to be interoperability with forward-looking technologies. If we get to the point that we have a self-sovereign identity, we need a system that will be interoperable with that self-sovereign identity. And then there's a myriad of identity requirements globally as far as identifying yourself and being a valid registered voter. So you really, I think we could almost do a whole nother session on just that, Gerard.
Yeah, I think we need to.
I think we should, because I think that is an emerging area and there's currently no one playing in that space. But it's
so let's make an official announcement, and thanks Susan Eustace for the fact that we're going to be doing a series on voters. I'm not on voting in elections, election systems, because I think that we need to target a different topic almost every month, like identity, voter rolls. Right. The chain of custody of votes, right? I mean,
we should really do during the blockchain week in May, that crossing our fingers is still happening in May at the Capitol in DC. I'm wondering if we shouldn't just do a series on voting instead of just doing a panel, but the week leading up to that, if we do a series and we do, one on identity and one on voter registration and one on transfer of votes, and we could almost do an entire series on elections and blockchain internationally.
I totally agree. So let's talk about that at our next voting working group call. We can flesh that out. I just want to highlight we have 45 minutes, right? We still need to get to Nimit, we need to get to Giles, and then we want to wrap up with Susan and talk about standards and stuff like that. So
right. So you know what? Let's move on to do you want to go Nimit or Giles next?
Let's do Giles. Giles is in Paris, and it's a little bit later there. Giles, what time is it where you are? Is that okay
for you, Nimit? Does that work for you? Just give me a thumbs up. I can see on the screen that you're okay.
All right.
Okay, perfect.
And hold on. So let me make sure that he can unmute himself. Yeah. So Giles, can you unmute yourself? No, not yet. Let's see if I can.
If that doesn't work for him, we can have Nimit go. So we'll see. Yeah. Well, oh, there you go, Giles. I see you've unmuted.
Okay, great. Thanks. So thanks a lot, Gerard and Amelia, for hosting me. Maybe let me introduce Electis, because I think we're a little bit of a different animal or organization than everyone else here on the table. Electis, we created a little bit more than a year ago. What we are is a do tank, and it's a non-profit do tank. And I guess why we got fascinated, my co-founder and myself. My co-founder comes from the startup world. I come from the institutional world. I was a civil servant. I was an advisor to different ministers, to President Sarkozy, and we realized that what was missing in this whole debate, or what we could be useful for, is the pragmatic approach. When I was listening about the debate around the MIT paper and how we can respond to that, there is of course a technical discussion, but at the end of the day, and I think Larry made it clear when he was talking about trust, is how people feel about these different voting instruments. And what we thought is, together with all the people who are developing solutions, here we have votes and clear ballot, and people who are really implementing them as you are, Amelia. How can we have a place where everyone gathers in a very non-profit manner and just test all these solutions and see what does work, what doesn't work, how can we better it, what is best for what kind of usage, because maybe there's not one size fits all solution.
Mhm.
When we talk about blockchain, Larry, you were saying there's security related issues and there's policy related issues, and I think blockchain certainly has a lot of say on security and accessibility, and there's technical answers to that. But there's also, at the end of the day, a policy answer to that. I think there's something very rich in blockchain. It's the fact that it's decentralized. And I think this has a huge impact on people's reaction. Amelia, you started saying like 2020 was, a catalyst year for voting. And because of course the US election showed how much there is to renovate in our systems. But I think in 2020, there's something else which happened, which is all these grassroots movements we saw around the world, and there's been Friday for Future, and there's been Black Lives Matters, and there's been all these youth movements and group movements everywhere. And what it shows is, there's an intern catalyst, the system is itself, questioning itself, and there's an outside catalyst. And people are not really trusting the system anymore. So blockchain there is very powerful. And so what we're trying to do with electees is to have that horizontal approach, which is embedded in blockchain itself. If we're building solutions, let's build them in a horizontal manner, in a decentralized manner, the same way that blockchain itself is built. And that's what we're trying to do with electees. So happy to elaborate more. Happy to have anyone here on the chat, to join us and be part of the community, because I think we need to be decentralized and horizontal if we want to build something that's going to be trusted by people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that in the past, people just trusted that the government entity counting the votes was valid. But I think, Giles, you made a great point. Globally, people have lost trust in the system. I think the COVID situation has really accentuated that. You have the number of people, I think prior, like January of this year, I think if you took a survey of people, do you trust what the World Health Organization tells you, you would have a high percentage of people who said that. And now that is a significantly lower amount of people, just because they're seeing information changing constantly. Plus, like you say, that I think everything from the World Health Organization to whoever counts our votes to, just like you say, with the Black Lives Matter, with the criminal justice system, there's a lot of distrust in the system. And I think you really did a good job of outlining that there needs to be that transparency and that ability. And I think elections is a great place for that.
And if I can bounce back on that, Amelia, I mean, because this leads to two things. It leads at people questioning the system itself. You can even have the best audited system. In Estonia, there is an electronic system which is centralized and fully audited. But if you would ask Estonia to run the same system with voters in Russia, and it will be just the two people deciding on the frontier, then of course there will be distrust, even if it's fully audited and ex post and everything. And at the same time, these movements, these grassroots movements, they are working on their own new electoral tools because they want to be more legitimate. So you have these two pressure at the same time. And I think, we can look at it as threat and saying like, oh my God, the whole system is going to collapse soon. Or you can look at it in a positive way, saying like, wow, there's all this energy around how you legitimate power and how you get into politics. And I think that's the bet we want to do with electees, bet on these people who want to build a new kind of trust. And I think we should, accompany that movement.
Right. I think that's a great point. I think the human spirit has always prevailed, right? 10,000 years, we've always prevailed. And I think that you're right. That's what I think, that it's a more sure bet that we bet on the human spirit than we just bet on complete collapse. I love that. I think that's a great way to put it. And you actually mentioned something that I think we haven't even talked about. And you talked about how some of these organizations are looking for their own voting solutions so they can become more legitimate. We've been talking about government elections this whole time, but there's a whole space on elections that is outside of government, right? There's an entire space of elections that is organizational elections. So that's something that maybe, Gerard, we should consider for the future or for other topics as well, is outside of government. There are trade associations, unions, standards organizations, grassroots movements. All of those have a need for elections and for these grassroots movements to have validity and security. I think that's a great point, Giles.
If I can take one example, to see how, I mean,
Giles, hey,
just a very small point.
Go for it.
For example, we're working with, at the COP26, which is the big, assembly on climate change, and only governments are there, to represent people. Now we're working with the UN and Yongo. Yongo is the youth NGO for climate change. So it's the parent NGO for all the youth NGOs on climate change. We're helping them to elect their representatives in a democratic manner. Because then the day they arrive at the table of the governments at the COP26, and they can claim, look, we've been elected in a transparent e-voting system. So we're as representative as you are, you governments. And this is going to be very powerful. So I think there's a lot of places in the world where you would see these organizations looking for new standards.